I've been trying to do some lessons that have reflected it and helped us to think about our daily Bible readings as we work through the Old Testament, and look at the books at kind of a 50,000 foot level and look at the general theme and overview of the book and keep it in its context. It's easy for us to get mired down in the verse by verse reading and sometimes miss some of the larger themes that are going on, some of the things that we want to be thinking about. And obviously one of the most important things for us when we read through the Old Testament is to never forget to make the connections and to see it as part of a larger piece of a larger puzzle that is being assembled in a story that is being told as we start to learn more and more about God and God's plan. And so when we think about this book, and again, like with Genesis, maybe not as, Genesis was a larger period, so I think the challenge was a little bit greater to come up with a central theme for that book. But as you're thinking about what the book of Exodus is about, and obviously the name itself, Exodus, the exit, but in a lot of ways, the book of Exodus is very much like the book of Genesis because it recreates some of the same patterns and some of the same concepts that we see in Genesis, only now we're doing it with a nation. We see God creating a nation and establishing it and bringing it out and preparing it for the work that God has given us to do. And as I was thinking about the theme of this book, if you had to come up with something, one statement, to me, it almost comes from an unlikely source. Because in Exodus chapter 5, when Moses and Aaron have come back, having talked to the people, and they've now come before Pharaoh for the first time, and they bring him the statement, "Thus says the Lord to Israel, let thy people go, that they may hold a feast to me in the wilderness." In Pharaoh's response, Pharaoh says in verse 2, "Who is the Lord that I should obey his voice?" As I thought about that a little bit, I think you can make a pretty good argument that is really the essence of the book of Exodus. That question, who is the Lord? And why should I listen to him? Because what God is going to have to establish in this book, and is what we read here, is that God is going to explain and to show and to prove who he is. As he basically reintroduces himself to a nation that has been some 500 years removed from any kind of direct revelation. They have a knowledge of God, but they need to be reintroduced to God. And that's really what's going on, I think, in this book. When we think about, as we remember the book of Genesis, as we talked about, is a book of beginnings. We're introduced to God and his power, and we see glimpses, I think, of his providence and his faithfulness in these things. And we see Abraham being called out of his homeland and the promises that are made to him that he will become a great nation. And we see that working its way down through Isaac and Jacob and eventually into the sons of Jacob who are brought down to Egypt. And we see the beginnings of that. But while it's not really specified how much understanding or how much thought they put into these promises, it's in the back of their minds, it seems like at least, that they are God's people, that they have been given a promise and that there's something waiting for them. And I don't know that we can say for sure what they knew about God as they were in Egypt, but I think it's fair to say that even in the days of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, their understanding of God was relatively limited. Even though they spoke directly to God, God really didn't show them everything. They saw little bits of it. And as we see that process throughout the book, is God is trying to get them to turn away from idolatry, to separate themselves from the nations around about them, to begin preparation for the mindset that is going to see themselves as a distinct and a holy people, which is going to come into play, obviously, in the book of Exodus. And we know that they knew something. We knew that they had some concept of the promised land and what was awaiting them, even while they were in Egypt, even during this time of some 400 years of Egyptian bondage. And we think about it, I would say that from the time of Isaac's birth until the time of Joseph's death, there was something in the area of like 250 years. And then you think of another 400 years of Egyptian bondage. These people are about 700 years removed from the first fulfillment of that promise of God. But as you remember, the end of Genesis leaves off with the question as Joseph comes to his brothers and he makes them swear an oath in chapter 15, tells them that that Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here. And it would seem that they had this in mind. They continued in this mind. We know that Moses makes a point of fulfilling this oath in Exodus chapter 13. So we know they were thinking about this, that at some point down the line, God is going to bring us out of this land and bring us somewhere else. Now, how much of that they understood and how much of that truly they knew, it's hard to say. So when we think about this question, who is the Lord and why should I serve him? The question could be asked by Israel as much as it could be about Pharaoh. And so we see this process beginning in this book of God introducing himself to Israel. And specifically, he starts, obviously, introducing himself to Moses. We see this story beginning in Exodus chapter 3. In verse 1, it says that now Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. And he looked, and behold, the bush was burning, and yet it was not consumed. And Moses said, I will turn aside to see this great sight, why the bush is not burned. And when the Lord saw that he had turned aside, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. And he said, Do not come near, take your sandals off your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. And he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. And so Moses here for the first time speaks with God and hears God, and God explains to him what he wants to do. And if you notice when Moses kind of pushes back on this, he asks the question, well, who am I going to say is coming? Who shall I say this is? If they ask me, who is this God that is calling me out? And God makes the statement in verse 14. He says, God says to Moses, I am who I am. He said, say to this people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. And God also said to Moses, say to the people of Israel, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever. And thus I am to be remembered throughout all generations. The idea that God is introducing himself, and we'll talk a little bit about this idea of the name of God here in a few minutes. But it's worth noting that when Moses comes back to the people in chapter 4 and talks to them and tells them and shows them the signs, what is their response? It says that in verse 31 that the people believed, and when they heard that the Lord had visited the people of Israel and that he had seen their affliction, they bowed their heads and worshiped. So this is a people that were ready to be delivered. They knew who God was, or at least had a concept of who God was, and they're ready to go. But what happens? The brakes kind of get slammed on, because in chapter 5, when Moses goes to Pharaoh and makes the statements that he makes and asks for the people to be allowed to leave and to go worship, Pharaoh's response is that if you were so worried about leaving and worshiping, you clearly have too much free time on your hands. Moses, you've been stirring up the people. You've been trying to create in them a spirit of rebellion, and we're going to fix that. So he adds to their labor. He forces them, now you're going to go get straw to make the bricks, which was supplied to you before, and you're still going to do the same amount of work. In the response of the people in chapter 5, when they go back to, it says that the foreman of the people of Israel in verse 19 saw that they were in trouble. And they met with Moses and Aaron who were waiting for them, and they came out from Pharaoh, and they said to them, the Lord look on you and judge, because you have made us to stink in the sight of the Pharaoh and his servants, and have put a sword in their hands to kill us. The idea that God is going to deliver them, but it's going to be hard before it gets easier. And they're going to have to be able to work through those difficulties in those times, and they don't yet have the faith that is established to be able to do that. And in chapter 6, I think one of the great statements, and in a lot of ways, maybe a definitive statement in this book, Moses goes back to the Lord. And in verse 1 of chapter 6, it says, but the Lord said to Moses, now you shall see what I will do to Pharaoh. For with a strong hand he will send them out, and with a strong hand he will drive them out of his land. God spoke to Moses and said, I am the Lord. I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob as God Almighty, but by my name, the Lord, I did not make myself known to them. I also established my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan, the land in which they lived as sojourners. Moreover, I have heard the groanings of the people of Israel, whom the Egyptians hold as slaves, and have remembered my covenant. Say therefore to the people of Israel, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. and I will deliver you from slavery to them, and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great acts of judgment. And I will take you to be my people, and I will be your God, and you shall know that I am the Lord your God, who has brought you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. I will bring you into the land that I swore to give to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. I will give it to you for a possession. I am the Lord. In a lot of ways, this is kind of an elaboration, I think, on what has been talked about and what God already told Moses back in chapter 3. Because if you remember, God at that point told him, this is who you're to tell the children of Israel that I am. Tell them I am has sent you. In the word I am is essentially the same word as that is used here for Lord, the word that we now typically pronounce as Jehovah or Yahweh. And it says that this is the name that they are going to know me by, that I didn't reveal myself to the fathers by that name, but I'm going to reveal it to Israel now. And that's kind of an interesting statement in and of itself. Because at least if we read the book of Genesis, and if you went through the trouble to click on the word in your Bible and look at the Aramaic or the original Hebrew, you'll know that the word Yahweh is not new in the book of Exodus. In fact, it has been used off and on throughout the book of Genesis. And there's some different ideas about why that will be the case. And I don't know that anybody really knows for sure. There's some possibilities. A lot of people have made the argument that the way the verse should be translated here is not that, but by my name the Lord, I did not make myself known to them, but rather it should say, but by my name the Lord was I not known to them. In other words, they knew me by that name, and I'm going to confirm that to you. And that's certainly possible. But the fact that most of the versions, in fact, I don't know of any version that renders it that way, makes it kind of unlikely, at least in my mind. I tend not to think that's what's going on. It may also be that the name Jehovah or Yahweh was not used by the patriarchs. But Moses, in writing these accounts, went back and filled it in because it would have kind of updated and it would have served as a bridge between the understanding of Genesis and the understanding of the people of Israel at that time. And that's not an unheard of thing. We have examples in the book of Genesis, if you remember right, of cities that were named something in the book of Genesis that we know that they weren't named that until much later on. So it's almost an anachronistic reference, but it's done that way to give you a common reference. And in fact, we do that today. We were watching a documentary about ancient Egyptian civilization the other day, and the narrator kept referring to Palestine. Well, Palestine hadn't even been imagined until thousands of years later. But we understand why she said that, because it was a modern reference that we would understand and we would have some connection to. So it's possible that that's what Moses is talking about here as well. But I think more likely is that the name now, as it is going to be shown to the people of Israel, is going to have a new significance and a different significance to them. It's not that the patriarchs didn't know the name of Jehovah, but they didn't see it for what it fully is. They didn't understand the full ramifications of what it means for God to be I am. If you remember back in Genesis 17, when it says that Abraham was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abraham and said to him, I am God Almighty. El-Shaddai is the translation. Walk before me and be blameless, that I may make a covenant between you. And the idea is that at that time and throughout the book of Genesis, really the picture of God is about El-Shaddai, the God who provides, the God who cares, the God who feeds. He is the source of all the blessings that they have. And we see the examples of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, each being blessed greatly. But the idea of Jehovah brings a different picture to the book. And the idea that you're going to see now God in a new way. You're not just going to see him as the God who provides, but the God who delivers. The God who fulfills his promises. The God who is able to do all that he is called to do. Why? Because I am. The translation either being, and there's some variations on how the term of Yahweh is defined. But generally speaking, most people will agree that it is the idea that the God who is and the God who will be, or the God who causes to be and the God who will cause to be, the God who is all powerful. It's the idea that this is the God who exists. And when you think about the contrast or the context in which Israel is living right now, they spent 400 years in the most idolatrous nation possibly in the history of the world. A nation in Egypt has gods for everything. They were ubiquitous. In fact, even Pharaoh himself was considered to be deity. And the idea of God coming and saying, I am. It's hard not to see that in the context of the idea that God is in contrast to the gods that you are surrounded with, which are not. And the idea is that God is now going to show you that he has power over all of these things because he is going to deliver you out of that land. He's going to deliver you out of bondage and show you the power that he has as the one God, the God that has called you. And when we look at that passage that we just read, you kind of see all these different statements about what God will accomplish. It says, I am the Lord, and that's a threefold confirmation. He starts off the statement with, I am the Lord. He binds it together with, I am the Lord, and he finishes everything else with, I am the Lord. And the idea that these are the things that God will accomplish that are going to show you that he is who he says. I will bring you out and deliver you. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm. I will take you to be my people and to be your God. I will bring you to the land and give it to you. The idea that God is going to do all these things for you without your help, without your power. And he says, when he does that, you will know that I am the Lord. And so we see this idea of God establishing himself. It's the idea, I think, that God now has to do something to establish this relationship, and it is to create a sense of belief. Because right now, what we see is a nation that understands who God is, but they don't truly believe. Because if you remember, when Moses goes back to the people with this message in chapter 6, the response is not like it was earlier. It says they didn't believe because they'd been crushed by the weight of the oppression of the Egyptians and by the added task. They weren't ready to believe anymore. And so God has to establish belief among the people. And it's interesting that we see that it's not just about belief among God's people. Because again, if you remember, we talked about this in Genesis, the idea that God, through the book of Genesis, narrows his focus more and more on a specific group of people. But there's always an indication that there are other people out there that even though they don't fall within that focus, they're still part of God's world. And God is still doing things to try to influence them and to try to hold them accountable and to remind them of who they are and who God is. And God talks about the idea to Moses that this is not just about proving to the Israelites, because he says in chapter 7, the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord when I stretch out my hand against Egypt and bring out the people of Israel from among them. He says in chapter 9, verse 16, but for this purpose I raised you up to show you my power, talking about Pharaoh, so that my name may be proclaimed in all the earth. Because what God's doing is not just introducing himself to Israel. He's introducing himself to the world. And he's doing it in a way that he never did during the times of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. As we talked about, we think about the power of God and we see it manifest obviously in the creation. And we see isolated examples of stories like Sodom and Gomorrah, where God has shown his power and rained down fire and brimstone and destroy this country. But for the most part, God did his work by providence. He revealed himself to man. He told them his plans. He protected them. But we don't see a lot of miraculous actions that are going on. And yet here in the book of Exodus, God is going to reveal himself to his people in a way that is more revealing, more powerful, more obvious. He is going to literally lead them out of the nation and create a new nation. We see this idea of God through the 10 plagues and through the power that is displayed that the Egyptian magicians are not able to copy, leaving without a shadow of a doubt that God is. And eventually Pharaoh is willing to let them out, as we know the story. God leads them to the Red Sea to make sure that they see one final time that God is going to not only deliver them from bondage, but he is going to destroy their enemies once and for all. And he does this in the miracle of the Red Sea. And we talked about a little bit last week, I guess, about the idea of the children of Israel being baptized into Moses and the symbolism that goes on to there. But the idea is that at this point, what we now see is a group of people that have crossed the Red Sea on dry land, have seen the deliverance of God, have seen his salvation, and they now believe. And so that belief has been established, and now the next step comes. Because it's not enough for them to simply accept and believe. And I'm using the belief a little bit accommodatively. When we talk about belief, we talk about a much stronger word than what we typically see in the world. But you understand what I mean. They understood that God was there. They see God every day in Exodus 13, talking about the idea that he went before them by day in a pillar of cloud to lead them along the way, by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, that they might travel by day and night. There was no mystery about whether God was or not. They all knew it. They knew he existed. But now they have to learn to trust. And so as a result of that, God brings them into the wilderness and sets them up in a situation where they're going to have to learn not only to believe that God is, but that God is going to take care of them, that God will be the provider under all circumstances. And we see a series of stories in the book now in the next few sections that where God now begins to outline this. We see in chapter 15, when they come to the place of Meribah where the water is bitter and God gives them water to drink, and he makes a covenant with them there. He says that the Lord made for them a statute and a rule, and there he tested them, saying, if you will diligently listen to the voice of the Lord our God and do what is right in his eyes and give ear to his commandments and keep all his statutes, I will put none of the diseases on you that I put on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord, your healer. You know, it was worth it. I didn't make this point earlier, but one of the things that they learned in the book, in the story of Egypt and the plagues that they saw, is that they see all these horrible things happening to all these the nation around them, and yet they are spared of all these things. And God makes the point that if you will follow me, if you will put your trust in me, and you will be my people, and I will be your God, then I will spare you of all the things that are going on. It's almost as if God is saying, you know, the curse that has been on the world since the Garden of Eden, I will not apply that to you. You're going to have great harvests. You're not going to be infected by diseases. Your cattle are not going to die. You're going to have abundance in all that you do if you're willing to follow God. And so we see the next test coming up in chapter 16, where God provides them with manna. And again, it's prompted by the grumbling of the people. And, you know, we talk about, this is where we typically talk about, well, those Israelites, they were always grumbling, they were always complaining. But the reality is, when it talks about the idea of going 3 days in the wilderness with no food and no water, I wonder what we would have been saying at that point. How we would have been reacting in those situations. I kind of feel like we might have been the ones right there asking Moses, where is our water? Why did you bring us out? As they say, why have you brought us out of the wilderness to die? Didn't you plan this out? And we see in chapter 16 that there was a reason that God does this. You know, God doesn't just bring them out into the wilderness because he didn't think things through and didn't bring them in a way. He took the bad way around, where, we just found out, well, there's not any food over here. Well, the point of this is he says in chapter 16, he says, behold, I'm about to rain bread from heaven to you, and the people shall go out and gather a day's portion every day, that I may test them, whether they walk in my laws or not. They're going to be put in a situation where the only source of sustenance they're going to have is from God. And to have that, you're going to have to collect it by God's rules. And so he's very specific about it. You're going to go out every morning and you're going to collect it, but you don't collect any more than you need, because if you collect more, it's just going to go to waste. It's going to spoil. And on Friday, you're going to collect more than you need. You're going to collect for Friday and Saturday, because on Saturday, there's going to be no bread. But if you'll trust God, that bread that you collected on Friday is going to maintain itself. It's not going to spoil this day, and you're going to have what you need for Saturday. And you can have the assurance that on Monday, the bread will be back. It's interesting to watch how, as the writer says, that the people really didn't quite believe this yet, because they still were going out and gathering too much. And on Saturday, some of them still went out to gather more. They still weren't quite there in terms of the trust and the understanding of what God was going to do for them. But gradually, this lesson begins to be impressed upon them. And we see the next example in the next chapter, in chapter 17. Now it's about water, because now they've gone into the wilderness where there is no water. And it's interesting, again, we see the people quarreling with Moses and saying, give us water to drink. And I always wonder whether the issue was not so much that, look, if you don't have water, you don't have water. It's not a lack of faith to say, if I don't have water to drink, pretty soon I'm going to die. Well, I can do two things. I can say, Lord, where's the water? Lord, give us water, please, so that we'll live. Or is it, how dare you bring me out into this wilderness without any water? Give us the water that we deserve, that we are entitled to, that you should have given us. And it says the people in verse 3 thirsted for water, and the people grumbled against Moses, saying, why did you bring us up out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst? And we read in verse 7, after Moses has struck the rock and the water comes forth, it says he called the name of the place Massa and Meribah because of the quarreling of the people of Israel and because they tested the Lord by saying, is the Lord among us or not? And that's an interesting thing because, again, this is the same people that are watching the pillar of fire by night and the cloud by day. They know that God is with them. Yet the question is the Lord among us or not? Well, why? Well, because even though they knew that the Lord was with them, the question was, but is the Lord going to take care of us? Is the Lord going to do for us what we need? And I suspect here that, again, in our own lives, when we think about what it means for the Lord to be with us, a lot of times we interpret that to mean, if the Lord is with me, that means I'm getting everything I want, I'm getting it when I want, and I'm not going through any kind of difficulty or hardship along the way. And that's how the Israelites seem to have looked at this. It's not really that different than how we often see our relationship to God today. But in the same chapter, God also shows that he's going to give them conditional protection against military foes. And just like with the Sabbath day bread, or with the bread that was given to them, there are conditions on this. He says, you're going to go out and fight with Amalek. And he puts Moses up on the top of the hill. And as long as Moses kept his arms up, everything was fine. But when his arms start to go down, the people of Israel started to lose the battle. And the message is pretty clear. If you'll trust in God and do things the way God wants you to do and follow God's directions, that God is going to give you the victory. The victory is not going to be because of your power or your strength. It is going to be from the power of God. And so God has shown that he is going to be there for them, that they can trust him. But the lesson that they're trying to learn now at this point, and that God is trying to teach them, is you're going to move from this idea of belief onto a feeling of dependence. The idea that the only reason that you're surviving in the wilderness right now is because God is sustaining you. And so once that lesson is, when we say learned, I think it's probably learned more than we give them credit for, but the grumblings obviously are going to continue. But the lesson has at least been taught. And now we come to the next step, because now we need to move beyond trust, and we need to move to the idea that you need to fear God. And so they learn to fear God at the mountain as they finally come to Mount Sinai when it's time for the law to be delivered. And we see the depiction of what that experience was like in chapter 19. And we talk about the idea of what it means to stand before God. And as we've talked about before, there's so many people that talk about all the things that they're going to say to God when they have the opportunity, and all the things that I'm going to, God and I are going to have a chat when I get up to heaven. Well, we start to see what it means to be in the presence of God. And it's an important lesson for the children of Israel in chapter 19, because in verse 16 and 17, we read the story. He says, on the morning of the third day, there were thunders and lightnings and a thick cloud on the mountain and a very loud trumpet blast, so that all the people in the camp trembled. And Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet God, and they took their stand at the foot of the mountain. And it's at this point that Moses is given the 10 Commandments, or at least God actually gives it directly, it sounds like, to the people. They hear the voice of God delivering the basics of this law. And their response in verse 19 is, you speak to us and we'll listen, but do not let God speak to us lest we die. And Moses' response is that do not fear, for God has come to test you, once again to test you. Why? That the fear of him may be before you, that you may not sin. And we oftentimes disregard the idea of fear in our relationship to God. We ought not to fear God. There's no reason for us to fear. But God gives a pretty good reason here. The idea that if you feared God, if you understood who God was and his power and his might and all that he is, if you really understood what the implications of the word of the name I am, you would be in fear. And as he says, if you really feared God the way you should, you wouldn't sin. And that's the purpose of this. And that message, it is amazing. And we think about the story that within 40 days, we've gone from saying we fear God, we'll do whatever God tells us to do. Just, Moses, you tell us we can't speak to God unless we die. to having idolatrous worship right there at the foot of the mountain after 40 days. Because as they say, well, we don't know what's going on. Moses is gone. He's probably dead. We don't know what's going on. It's time for us to move on to do something else. The fear really hasn't been established yet. And so we see the story of Moses coming down from the mountain with smashing the stones. 3,000 men are killed as a result of this. And now maybe maybe God has their attention now. But now it's up to Moses to intercede because God's ready to end it right now as we read. That God is ready to start. He tells Moses, look, let them alone. I'm going to wipe them out and I'll make of you a great nation. And Moses intercedes, and we see this in Exodus chapter 32. And it's interesting to see how he intercedes and why he intercedes. He says in verse 11 of chapter 32, but Moses implored the Lord his God and said, O Lord, why does your wrath burn hot against your people, whom you have brought out of the land of Egypt with great power and with a mighty hand? Why should the Egyptians say, with evil intent did he bring them out to kill them in the mountain and to consume them from the face of the earth? Turn from your burning anger and relent from this disaster against your people. Remember Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, your servants, to whom you swore by your own self. And said to them, I will multiply your offsprings as the stars of heaven. And all this land that I promised I will give to your offspring, and they shall inherit it forever. And the Lord relented from the disaster that he had spoken of bringing on the people. It's interesting that Moses, when he appeals to God, he doesn't appeal to the covenant. He doesn't say, God, you just gave us this law, and you've said that you're going to protect us, and we're going to be your people, and we have this law that you've given us, and we agreed to do it. Why? Because the covenant's been broken. You couldn't keep the covenant. What does he appeal to? He appeals to the promise. He goes back to Abraham. And we're not going to spend we could spend a whole lesson on that, but just bear that in your mind. That when it came down to why God spared Israel on this day, it had nothing to do with the law, and it had everything to do with the promise that he made to Abraham. It had everything to do with God's grace. And through God's grace, we see their threat of death repealed, and we see the process repeated. Moses comes back to the mountain. He receives the law again. He comes back down. And this time there's no idolatry going on. This time the people, at least in this case, have learned their lesson. And it's interesting to see how the rest of this section goes on. Because now that they have learned to fear God, there's one more step. And that is that they need to learn to honor God as holy. Because now we're going past the idea of just simply staying away from the mountain for fear of death. There's the idea now that if God is all of these things, then he is worthy of my worship, and he is worthy of being treated in such a way that I'm going to listen to everything that he says. I'm going to approach him in the way that he calls to be approached, not because I'm afraid I'm going to die, but because he is worthy of those things. Because I can't just simply give him any type of worship. And so we see the instructions, and we actually backtrack a little bit over to Exodus 25, where we see all the instructions that Moses has given about how the tabernacle is going to be built, the place where God will dwell among his people. It says in verse 1 of chapter 25, the Lord said to Moses, "Speak to the people of Israel that they may take from me a contribution. For every man whose heart moves him, you shall receive the contribution for me." And he goes on to talk about all the things that they're going to collect. And in verse 8, he says, "And let them make me a sanctuary that I may dwell in their midst. Exactly as I show you concerning the pattern of the tabernacle and of all its furniture, so you shall make it." And we get the description in the next few chapters of the dimensions, of the details of the artwork, everything that's going to go into the details of this tabernacle, the ark, the table, the lampstand, the veils, everything, the tapestries, all these things, all the way down to the hooks that are going to hold all the walls together. And all of this, as you start to see, is built in a way that keeps God separate from man. The idea that God is going to dwell in your midst, but he's not going to be accessible to you. He's going to be walled off from you. And certain people will be allowed to go in. As he says, the Lord appointed Aaron and his children to be the ones that are going to come in and minister in the tabernacle. But even they don't get to do it all the time. They have to be dressed in a certain way. And they have to offer sacrifices in a certain fashion, all the way down to the specific ingredients of the incense that they're going to offer and the oil with which they're going to anoint. All of these things have to be done exactly the same way. And the overriding message of all of this is that if you want to come before God, you have to be pure. You have to be sanctified for that purpose. You have to be specifically invited into the presence of God, and only under the conditions that are set by God. The rest of the people have to be content that God is there, even though he is separated from them, even though they need a mediator to come between them and God, to offer sacrifices on the behalf. They have to be content with the fact that God is there and that we know he's there. And it's interesting that God, as he gives these directions, that God doesn't leave the construction of the tabernacle up to chance. God wants the tabernacle done a specific way, but God doesn't just say, all right, do your best, and if you don't get it right, it's going to be on you. Because we read in chapter 31 that God actually even endows certain men with the ability to do all the things that he's asked them to do. It says in verse 1 of chapter 31 that the Lord said to Moses, see, I have called by name Bezalel, the son of Uri, the son of Hur, of the tribe of Judah, and I have filled him with the Spirit of God, with ability and intelligence, with knowledge and all craftsmanship, to devise artistic designs, to work in gold, silver, and bronze. And he goes on and talks about the idea that I have given to all able men ability that they may make all that I have commanded you. He gave them an extraordinary task to be able to do all these things the way it is called to do, but he doesn't leave them without the ability to do so. And to credit the people respond. The same people that were committing idolatry at the foot of the mountain all of a sudden have a zeal for God and have a zeal to do for God what he has called them to do. So much so that in chapter 36, when we see that the workers that are going to build the tabernacle come together, they tell Moses that the people keep bringing free will offerings every morning, so that all the craftsmen who were doing every sort of task on the sanctuary came each for the task that he was doing, and said to Moses, the people bring much more than enough for doing the work that the Lord has commanded us to do. So Moses gave command, and word was proclaimed through the camp, let no man or woman do anything more for the contribution for the sanctuary. So the people were restrained from bringing. Yeah, the people had a will. It sounds almost a lot like it's reminiscent of what we're going to read when they rebuild the temple as they come back. The people had a will to work. They had a will to give. We oftentimes criticize the Israelites for their lack of faith, but what we see here is a great zeal for God and a zeal to make this tabernacle and to build it. And so we see that, this is the part of Exodus that I think becomes probably difficult to read. And if you're like me, you start to maybe skim a little bit because it becomes very repetitive, doesn't it? And it's interesting to see, we see, first of all, in the first part where God is going to command Moses to do all these things. And he describes all the things that you're going to do. Then Moses goes back and we read again, but this time we read how they made them. And it's interesting to see that essentially he just rewrites the same thing. And we wonder, well, why are we reading this again? And then the third time we come back, and although the details aren't given there, the writer then recounts once again that once they were done, they bring the things to Moses, and Moses goes back and checks all of them. And he goes through all the things that they brought. We wonder, why are we reading these things over and over again? And I think the answer becomes pretty obvious that Israel understood the idea that we need to make sure that this is right. Moses didn't just send the workers off. The workers did their work and came back and put it all in a pile, and Moses just said, okay, I'll take your word for it. It says that Moses inspected all these things. In verse 42 of chapter 39, it says, in verse 43, Moses saw all the work, and behold, they had done it. As the Lord had commanded, so had they done. And then Moses blessed them. The work wasn't done, the work wasn't approved until they knew that they had done everything exactly as God had called them to do. And so we see, as the story closes in the book of Exodus, as we talked about the close of the book of Genesis, it closes with the cloud covering the tent of the meeting in chapter 40. The glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. It says that Moses was not even able to enter the tent of meeting before the cloud settled on it. We really kind of see the story coming full circle. God has taken his people. He has redeemed them out of Egypt and brought them into the land. And it closes with the symbol of his fellowship with them, his covenant, God's tabernacle being occupied. And so we see this picture. And as we back up and see what happened and we think about what we just read as we've gone through the story, we see God calling out a people from the world to become his chosen people. We see them being delivered from bondage. We see their foes defeated once and for all. We see them brought into the wilderness of God, where they're prepared to enter into a promised place of rest by learning to trust in God. And we think to ourselves, well, what is the relevance of the book of Exodus to me today? It ought to become pretty obvious. Because we start to see that there's a lot of patterns and shadows. Again, we could spend weeks talking about all the things that Exodus shows us to understand that there is something that is still not revealed. There's something that's still waiting. We ask the question, well, did Israel truly know the name of the Lord yet? He's been revealed to them, and they've seen him in a way that we haven't seen God. And yet there's something more, isn't it? Because we see some language later on. If you turn over in the book of Isaiah, God has a lesson yet for these people to learn. They know God, but they don't yet know God. In Isaiah chapter 52, as we close the lesson, or close this thing out, it says in verse 3, verse 5, now therefore, what have I here, declares the Lord, seeing that my people are taken away from nothing. You know, the same people that were brought into the land of Israel, that were taught to trust God, taught to treat God as holy. They have been established in Canaan. They've raised kings. They have conquered nations. They have built wealth, and they turn their back on God to serve idols. So much so that now their time in Canaan is about to end. They're about to be taken away into exile. He says, what will I do? Declares, seeing that my people are taken away for nothing. Their rulers wail, declares the Lord, and continually all the day my name is despised. Therefore, in verse 6, my people shall know my name. Therefore, in that day they shall know that it is I who speak. Here I am. It almost kind of sounds like we're doing this whole thing again. In that day, they will know that I am. But what does he go on to say in verse 7? How beautiful upon the mountains are the feet of him who brings good news, who publishes peace, who brings good news of happiness, who publishes salvation, who says to Zion, your God reigns. The voice of your watchmen, they lift up their voice. Together they sing for joy. For eye to eye they see the return of the Lord to Zion. Break forth together into singing, you waste places of Jerusalem. For the Lord has comforted his people. He has redeemed Jerusalem. The Lord has bared his holy arm before the eyes of all the nation, and all the ends of the earth shall see the salvation of our God. You know, the idea that God has another set of works that he's going to do, that just as the world knew who God was because he brought the people out of Israel, God has one more thing he's going to show, and all the world will know that he is God. As we think about the things that we see carried forward, the salvation of God being revealed is when John the Baptist comes in the wilderness in Luke chapter 3, he quotes the idea of Isaiah where he says that every valley shall be filled, every mountain hill shall be made low, the crooked shall become straight, the rough places shall become level ways, and all the flesh shall see the salvation of God. You're now going to see what it is that God has had in his mind from the very beginning. We see the sustenance of God that gives an even greater assurance than what we saw of Israel. As we see the story in John 6 of Jesus feeding the multitudes with the bread. And he tells them in verse 48 that I am the bread of life. Your fathers ate the manna in the wilderness and they died. This is the bread that comes down from heaven so that one may eat it and not die. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. If anyone eats of this bread, he will live forever. The idea of food that has greater promises than this life, the full glory of God. We didn't even talk about the story of Moses seeing the glory of God, and it's a lesson in and of itself. But the idea that they saw this amazing picture of as close as any of us have ever come to seeing God on the mountain. Moses is getting a greater view, of course, than the rest, but all of them saw the manifestation of God, and yet none of them had seen the full glory of God. And what do we read in Hebrews 1:1-3? That long ago, at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets, but in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed the heir of all things, through whom also he created the world. He is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature, and he upholds the universe by the word of his power. And John 1:14 says that the word became flesh and dwelled among us, and we beheld his glory. That is that of the only begotten Son. And we talk about what it means to see God. And yet man has seen God. He has seen him in a way that was never possible before in the coming of Jesus to this world. We see the purpose of the tabernacle finally being fulfilled. In Hebrews chapter 9, we think about why were all these things put in place? They were put in place to separate man from God, to keep man apart until the time would come when Jesus enters the tabernacle and ends it. In chapter 9, verses 11 through 12, the Hebrew writer says, "But when Christ appeared as a high priest of the good things that have come, then through the great and more perfect tent, not made with hands, that is not of this creation, he entered once for all into the holy place, not by means of the blood of goats and calves, but by means of his own blood, thus securing an eternal redemption." And we see that the way to God's promised rest is now open. As he talks about in Matthew 25, when he describes the final scene of judgment, he says, "The king will say to you, 'Come, enter into the rest that I have prepared for you from before the foundations of the earth." We see the fullness of the book of Exodus revealed to us in the name of God fully revealed. Because in Philippians 2, Paul writes, "Therefore God has highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name that is above every name, so that the name of Jesus every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father." Exodus is a book of redemption, of deliverance, of trust, of fear, and of honor. But it is also a book of Jesus. As we remember all these stories in the law, we keep our mind focused on the fact that all these things are there to point us to that time when Jesus is going to come to this earth. And we see all the things that they had to do, all the things that they had to accomplish in order to be in the presence of God, all of them accomplished by the death, burial, and resurrection of one man, Jesus Christ. So as we continue reading, of course, we're finished with Exodus. I'm not going to do a lesson on Leviticus, so don't worry about it. I'm trying to decide which books. I'm not going to do this every week. If I did this for every book, we wouldn't have time to talk about anything else. So I'm going to try to be selective about it, but we'll take a break from Leviticus. But as we do these readings, again, we keep one eye on the text and we keep one eye on God, and one eye on Christ, knowing that all these things are leading us to something greater. So hopefully this lesson has been helpful, and as we continue on our reading, to stick with it and to think about it in terms of what it is designed to teach us and how it is designed to lead us to God. So the lesson is yours this morning. If you have any need of the saints this morning, if you have any prayers that need to be offered on your behalf, if you need our help in studying the Bible and you want to come closer to God, if you want to be baptized into Christ, if you're online and you want to study with us, we're willing to do whatever you need. Whatever you need, maybe just let us know as we're letting our invitation song.